time has finally come for me to rouse from my swan slumbers and put out new content on this channel. One of the things I'll be doing this year is really trying to sink my teeth into the modding community of Total War Warhammer and check out how things are going in the workshop. While I will of course be judging the lore accuracy of these mods, the main focus will be on my enjoyment and experience with said mods. I bet you've all seen the thumbnail, so let's not waste any more time and begin our exploration of the OvN Lost Factions Fimir Mod. Let's start with the gameplay. First and foremost, I'll be focusing on the experience I had while playing this mod. The Fimir faction is split into two legendary lords that have rather dramatic differences in how their campaigns function. First is the Fimir matriarch Sotek, which I think is supposed to be a play on the legendary Irish warrior Skaha, a Irish warrior woman whose name apparently means the shadow or shadowy one, which, seeing as the Fimir are loosely based on the Fomorians of Irish legend, adds a fitting if extremely loose connection. In any case, Sotek the matriarch is the more standard faction, who grants you a powerful Fimir wizard with an interesting mix of spells and all sorts of nasty unique abilities to make her quite fierce. She provides quite a few tasty buffs to the elite Fimir units in your roster, in addition to granting the ability to summon demon units using the Warriors of Chaos mechanics that they got in their most recent DLC. With her start position in the Wasteland province on the western shore of the Empire, she can have a relatively difficult opening on her campaign, as there are quite a few enemies in just about all directions. Unfortunately, her campaign is extremely buggy, at least when I played it, needing frequent reloads to ensure all the features are functional. However, the OvN guys do excellent work, so I'm sure it won't be long until those things are sorted out. There are some notable redundancies in the roster for her, such as being able to acquire the demonic Fimir units through your buildings or the Gifts of Chaos system, which feels kind of unnecessary and just adds clutter. The mod does also seem to fall prey to the typical issue that I have with mods, in that it's a bit too powerful or efficient when it comes to faction abilities and the tech tree. For instance, anytime you claim an enemy settlement, when you sack or raise, you can acquire an army-wide buff for 3 turns if you sack and 5 turns if you raise that grants regeneration healing and a leadership bonus, which is kind of insane. I think it's a little weaker, or maybe even notably weaker than regular regen, but still, just army-wide healing for the entirety of the battle is pretty nuts. The tech tree is also very strong and relatively short, but honestly, that's not a huge concern. The skill trees for the characters are overall not too bad, though the two legendary lords can get a bit overstrong for my liking. Speaking of legendary lords, let's take a brief look over at the mother of 1,000 young herself, Kroll the Demon Princess. I'll just cut to the chase and say that Kroll's campaign is so absurdly easy, due to a fairly chill start position over at the Monument of the Moon in Lustria, combined with her extremely powerful abilities. Kroll is a gigantic bog octopus who essentially has Colex passive of being able to vastly increase her own stats by building a special landmark type building in every provincial capital in her empire. Furthermore, she gets more buffs for every benchmark you cross, meaning that after you build 5 shrines and 5 of your major settlements, she takes another big step towards godhood. Conceptually, I find this campaign to actually be quite good and more enjoyable than Sotek, with the shrines providing a strong incentive to be aggressive to capture as many major settlements as fast as possible, which combos very nicely with your goal to acquire lots of slaves for various sacrifices and such. Though Kroll is such a powerhouse, I found her campaign to be far too easy, even on the highest difficulties. When looking at the Fimir factions overall, their rosters have a reasonable balance. While I have quite a few issues with their design from a lore perspective, which we'll get into later, when looking at gameplay, the roster has a healthy mix of options. Some of the units have conflicting designs, most notably the Eye of Balor, which is essentially a Luminarch of Hysh fused with a Chaos War Shrine. So you want it to be close to the fighting to power up its aura, but at the same time you want it away from the fighting at long range so it can draw a healthy line of sight to the enemy units and snipe targets. It has that kind of gunpowder type line of sight where it's a straight line, so it can't really see over your units. This is not a great unit design due to this, in my opinion, though frankly, the Eye of Valor is powerful enough in combat via chariot charges that you can easily ignore the shooting and just focus on it as a combat piece. In any event, the Fimir faction also relies on captives or slaves to utilize various abilities and buffs. It's very similar to the Dark Elf system, where you can get lovely passive buffs on certain structures should you have enough slaves available in your pool at that time. There are also provincial dictats you can use, but there's only 2, though they're both quite strong when used properly. One of them is basically to give you growth and construction cost reduction. The other one is to make defending your province notably easier. Overall, the gameplay is solid, though Sotek definitely struggled due to the bugs in my last playthrough. By the time you watch this video, that may well be resolved. We'll hope for the best. When looking at the mod from the perspective of, did I have fun? Yes. Yes, I did, actually. I imagine this is the case on most of the OvN Lost Faction mods based on what I've heard, but the Fimir was my first deep dive, and frankly, I had a blast. I played my first sessions with Sotek, and while she was enjoyable, I'll admit there were a number of issues I had, mostly due to her start position. I would highly recommend being very aggressive and getting the hell out of the wasteland ASAP if you play her. Plus, while her magic is decent, especially if you just spam Blue Fire of Tzeentch all the time, she doesn't really have any big spells despite being a caster-focused lord, so it's kind of strange because she doesn't really feel like she gets stronger as you level her up until you get your unique skill tree and you get access to various like damage auras that she has. Her spell list, it's kind of meant, I think, to show that she doesn't really have access to any like super powerful abilities. Instead, she only has like low access powers of the various dark gods. But I really feel like she could have used something a little meatier. But, you know, it is what it is. Kroll, on the other hand, is just pure, awesome kaiju level goodness. I honestly would highly recommend the Kroll experience, as it's absolutely delightful to use the tentacle monster to just smash apart savage orcs, lizardmen, dark elves, vampire pirates, and more. Plus, all of her mechanics synergize so well together. While Sotek puts a much higher drain on your slave pool, so it can be a bit of a struggle. Overall, though, a very enjoyable experience with both characters. Moving on to why I think most people are watching the video, let's talk about the lore. So, there are many mods, like the OvN Lost Faction series, that claim to be quote-unquote lore accurate, by either calling upon the tabletop or the publications of Warhammer Fantasy. In this mod's case, it literally says on the workshop, the Fimir race has a fully custom roster with access to some vanilla units. The custom units all draw from the tabletop and lore. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and toss out here before I get going that this metric is actually way more deceptive than anyone thinks it is, just due to how much Warhammer Fantasy has evolved over the last 40 years. There are a significant number of creatures, spells, items, and lore tidbits that no longer exist in the setting, but to somebody out there, it is their favorite part of the setting. Perhaps it's the centaurs, or half-orcs, or the gods of order. If you just ask yourself why you've never heard of those, it's because in 99% of cases, you will never encounter them as they're not relevant to the world Total War Warhammer is based on. But there's always going to be at least one person in the room who has not only heard of them, but also thinks they should be in the game. Looking at you, Great Book of Grudges. Love you. I bring this up to explain why the lore accuracy of a mod frankly doesn't matter. It's a fairly subjective metric and only comes into play when talking about an official piece of content, which obviously mods are not. So I'm not going to rake these mods over the coals. Instead, I'm just going to speak about how the mod interacts with the Warhammer world that Total War draws from and if it fits or not. So, how does the Fimir faction mod slot into the ever-shifting puzzle that is the Warhammer Fantasy world? Not well, to be honest. I've played my fair share of mods, and this has to be one of the least lore-accurate ones I've ever seen. This is likely due to the creators of the mod pulling nearly all of the content from fan-made works, such as the Warhammer Army Project's Fimir book. These books are made to look official and are crafted with love, but ultimately the lore is completely non-canon and tends not to mesh well at all with the Warhammer world as it stands. The only parts of this roster that are accurate in their depiction and use are the units that come straight from the Norska DLC. Everything else is frankly problematic. The Fimir do indeed have Mires, or matriarchs, as their legendary lord equivalent, but instead of using an actual lore character like Muna Mim, who I've done a video on covering if you want to check out, which you totally should, this mod pulls out Sotek, who isn't an established character. Furthermore, she's far too small, as matriarchs are said to be considerably larger than the rest of their clan. They're by no means equal in size to like a giant, but more on par with Throg or the River Troll Hag when compared to regular trolls. It's quite a shame that this Sotek is so tiny. Furthermore, she doesn't have a unique lore of magic like Muna Mim's marsh magic, instead having a mix of Dark, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. Granted, that is interesting, but the spells don't feel like they mesh together very well, and I feel this relies far too heavily on the Fimir's relationship to the Dark Gods, while simultaneously trying to ignore it, which we'll get into more in a second. The final issue with Sotek is her name, which we spoke about earlier. Why isn't she named after an actual Fomorian of myth, like Elatha, instead of Skaha, who is an enemy of the Fomorians, if anything, considering her part in the saga of Kukulane? That part stuck out to me like a sore thumb, but using Muna Mim would solve all of these problems. Yes, I'm biased, leave me alone. Also, I was trying to pronounce those vaguely correctly, but I probably didn't. Please don't crucify me. Speaking of too small, the mod does a bizarre move of splitting up the other Fimir classes into different sizes when we don't have any modern evidence to suggest that this is a feature of their species. In fact, all of our modern Fimir lore points to the opposite, with the Dyrax and Fim being the same size, which likely includes the Shurl class. The only notes about the difference between the Fim, which are the warrior caste, so like the regular units you see in the Norska mod, and the Shurls, which are the slave caste, which are the only unit size caste, we'll say, that don't appear in the Norska mod, is that the Fem, or the warrior caste, are born with bony protrusions or clubs on the ends of their tails, which denotes them as warriors. The Shurls, or the slave class, are not supposed to be notably smaller like the roster in this mod would suggest. Furthermore, there are literal Fem warrior units that are also just infantry sized. So despite the fact that there are Fem, so there's only those 4 castes of Fimir. Mirgs, the Fem, the Dirac, and the Shurls. Yet this mod takes the Fem class and splits it into 2, with there being Fimir warriors, which they made infantry sized, and then say the Fianna Fem, which they made normal Fimir sized, which is very strange. It doesn't make any sense. Granted, all of this can be blamed squarely on the Warhammer Armies Project Fimir book, which introduced all of this confusion for the mod creators. The only part of this roster that is truly lore accurate, as I've said, are the parts taken directly from the Norska mod. I will admit, though, that Fen beasts are an actual thing, so we will give points there. They're not typically associated with the Fimir, instead having their origin tied to the Druids of Albion and usually more heavily associated with life wizards. That being said, as fairly frightening creatures that are functionally swamp golems, I don't see a huge issue with them being in the Fimir roster. And Muna Mim, who I keep bringing up, does actually use Fen beasts as part of her lore, but that's supposed to kind of be something unique to her. Other than that, everything else is just wrong. I will note that the original army book, and therefore this mod, decided to take the Fimir as a Warhammer interpretation of the Irish mythological monsters called the Fomorians. Hence, the vast majority of the roster, including the mentions of a god named Balor, are drawn from there. But at the same time, they also have a Nucalavi, which itself is apparently drawn from Scottish mythology. I don't know, they might also have it in Ireland. I don't want to stick my put in any kind of weird pot around here as to where the differences between those two cultures lie. But to my understanding, there are notable differences between those two cultures and their mythologies. But maybe it's not as defined as a line as I think it is. I will say that overall, I do actually love this idea. I love the idea of the Fimir as a race and the various entities they summon, the demonic creatures that they form bargains with and bring forward to make pacts with, being these really spooky creatures from Irish and I suppose Scottish mythology. The Knuckle of V, I will say in particular, I think fits extremely well within this role. It's a very cool monster that if you've never looked up, you should, because it's freaky and it fits Warhammer very nicely and would make for an excellent cavalry unit. However, I will say that while these frightening creatures joining the lore do look very cool, they don't really fit with the lore that we have established and are not supported at all by Warhammer fantasy literature. Furthermore, there are some strange combinations made. Like, why are Boglars in the Fimir roster? That is a very strange decision, in my opinion. While we do have the likes of Noblars working with the Ogre Kingdoms, that was a forced relationship caused by the Chaos Dwarfs coming down to their territory, and you still have what is functionally a goblinoid race working with something that is very, very closely related, being the ogres. They're kind of in that same destruction category, where they're not a chaos race, they're not an undead race, they're not an order race, they're kind of in that destro ballpark. So they work well together. I think having Boglars, which are a type of Noblar, though native more to swamps, though in some books they're more argued to be goblins, but I think they tie their genealogy closer to Noblars, which Noblars are a type of goblin, so it doesn't really matter. But them working with the Fimir, I will say, is very, very strange and feels like a huge stretch. Having greenskins openly working with the forces of chaos, it's not impossible. It can happen, but I will say it just kind of feels like someone looked at a book about the Fimir and was just reading that, oh, they're in swamps and in bogs, and then they also saw the word Boglar and said, oh, so these naturally would go together. And I just find that to be a huge stretch. Plus, if Boglars are going to be more heavily related to Noblars, which I believe they are, though I could be wrong on that because Boglars are from a very specific mention, I believe, in a White Dwarf magazine. So they're a little bit, whether or not they're canon anymore is a little bit funky, though I would consider that they probably are. But whether or not they're actually something notably different from Noblars or Goblins, being a more aquatic adapted species, or whether they're just Noblars or goblins that happen to live in a marsh, kind of like how night goblins and forest goblins aren't really that different from regular goblins. They just happen to live in different environments and have very slight differences. In any event, they really shouldn't be a part of this roster. It doesn't really make sense. It's fine to have them in, of course, for a mod, but if you're looking for lore accuracy, they have no business being there. And a Boglar Shaman is also a pretty big stretch. If they're more on the Noblar side of things, they shouldn't have shamans. Noblars don't have shamans. There are types of greenskins that just don't seem to have that kind of connection to Great Green, which is, of course, the name for the space that connects with Gork and Mork. But furthermore, another issue I noted with this mod that I wanted to talk about very briefly from a lore perspective is that, and I believe it's more due to the mod makers clashing with the book writer of the book they base this mod on, which once again is not an official piece of Warhammer literature. It's literally just someone's fan fiction, though it's very well written fan fiction, even though I don't think it meshes well with the Warhammer world, is that the Fimir are a chaos worshipping species. They don't have any other pre-established religion. They don't have anything we know of that came before that. They do seem to be a primordial species that has existed before the arrival of the old ones. And then after the old ones arrived, they kind of fell into hiding in the marshes and the bogs and such. And then when Chaos came out, they were one of the first races to dedicate themselves to Chaos, very similar to the Dragon Ogres. But from there, they fell out of favor with the Dark Gods and have kind of languished in the shadows ever since. But this mod kind of tries to have its cake and eat it too regarding that particular storyline, in that it shows the Fimir utilizing a lot of Chaos things, with Skatok having literal chaos spells from Slaanesh and Tzeentch and Nurgle, and in your tech tree, you even have specific texts regarding them, and you're able to dedicate certain things to them. But in the same time, it has Krull, for instance, who's supposed to somehow be a demon princess octopus, but she's not associated with any of the dark gods. She seems to have become a demon princess just because. So she's like an undivided demon princess, which it's all very weird. And granted, Krull is very heavily based on Cthulhu mythos, based on the, I cannot remember its name off the top of my head, but the Mother of 1,000 Young is an epithet for one of Tolkien's creatures and has a lot in common with Krull, so it seems directly ripped from that. But Krull came from that fan book. And so you have all these, the fan book removes the Fimir's relationship with chaos. And it makes it where the Fimir have their own relationship with these other gods. So they have Balor, who's like the big dark god of the Fimir. And then you have Krull, who's this demon princess that's attempting to ascend to godhood, which completely clashes with the idea that the Fimir are worshipping the dark gods of Nurgle, Tzeentch, Khorne, and Slaanesh. At least in my opinion. And I'm really, really not a fan of having both of those themes in the same army. I think you got to pick one lane. Driving in both of them, I think, adds a lot of confusion and messiness. But overall, you know, I'm going to end it there. I think I've gotten my point across of the lore of this is completely nonsensical. From a lore standpoint, this mod is bleh. But a lot of fun, though. And like I said, the lore shouldn't be that big of a deal. As far as how I feel about it overall, in conclusion, in summary, I will give it a brief rating, and then after I give it its ratings, I will say whether or not I recommend it. So for gameplay, on a 5-point scale for all three of these, I would say the gameplay is a good 4 out of 5, probably 3.5 out of 5. It's fun, it's functional, but it does not feel terribly well balanced in my opinion. And of course, it does seem to have a couple of issues due to various interactions, but like I said, by the time you play this mod, maybe those bugs have been fixed. When it comes to how fun it is, I would give it a 4.5 out of 5. It's very, very fun, very enjoyable. It's a really good time. I would say play Krull first, maybe come back to Sotek later. I would recommend maybe replacing Sotek with a cooler character like Muna Mim, but I'm not a mod person, and I don't want them to feel like I'm trying to bully them or anything like that. And when it comes to the lore, I would give it, I'm not going to give it a 0 because it does actually have some lore accurate stuff, mostly, almost entirely, I should say, from the Norska mod. So I'll give it a 1 out of 5, which will probably be the lowest rating I will give, unless it is just so bad that it just doesn't even deserve a 1. So I would say a 1 out of 5. Like it's very poor from a lore standpoint, at least in my opinion. I could continue to ramble on forever, but I think I've said everything that I need to get the point across about how I feel about the mod, and that it's quite enjoyable and explores some really interesting ideas, but it doesn't really pull anything from the established lore. And we actually have quite a bit of really exciting Fimir lore to work with now, thanks mostly to the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition book, but we also have quite a bit of Fimir lore from the Monstrous Arcanum and the Storm of Magic supplements that came out in 8th edition. So if you combine those three sources together, which if you're looking at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I'd recommend reading the core rulebook, and then check out the adventure called If Looks Can Kill, which I believe is still offered for free on their website, or it's included in the Uberstrikes Adventures Part 1, I think? Might be Part 2. It's either Part 1 or Part 2. I forget which one. But if you combine all those sources together, you can actually draw a really solid understanding of the Fimir and see that they're quite narrow. You know, they're very similar to the Dragon Ogres. They're really not meant to be a standalone race. I honestly find it very strange that they decided to make the Fimir a standalone race. To me, that feels like making the Dragon Ogres a standalone race. There's just really not enough there to do it. Now, you know, they did it anyway, and I think there is some really cool stuff in it. But overall, I hope the OvN faction mod makers might consider making some slight adjustments in the future to their mod to make it closer to the lore. But as I said, I'll be the first to admit there's no real reason to do that at all. If I was the one making the mod, I would tell myself to shut up, and I'm not going to bother doing that, because that sounds like work for whoever is recommending that, not the person who actually would have to do the work. and I don't know shit about making mods. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope this was enjoyable. Please let me know what mods you would like me to check out down below, especially if you want me to take a lore critical look at them. Once again, I want to make it very, very clear, I'm not here to shit on mods. I almost forgot. The recommendation. I would highly recommend this mod. I would definitely, 100%, without hesitation, recommend you download this mod, give it a try, play both campaigns. Do let me know what you think down below. Did you play this mod? If so, what were your thoughts on it? How did you feel about the 2 character campaigns? Is there anything that stuck out to you? Is there anything that I said that you agree with or disagree with? Just, let me know all those deets. I hope you all are having a lovely start to your 2023, and I'll see you guys around. Thanks so much for watching.